Hello, YouTubers. So I'm giving another book review, and I'm going to be talking about The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. Straight off the bat, I would say that I'm going to give this book a 5 out of 5. Why? Well, I think that I know it's controversial. I know that a lot of people have issues with that. However, I do think, regardless of your religious perspective, whether you believe in God or whether you don't believe in God, I do think it's a very good book for people to read because I do think it clearly lays out different types of belief in terms of whether you're religious or not, or different types of non-believers, agnostic, all the way up to hardcore atheists. I do think it outlines a good case for the arguments of God. Well, let's see about that. Not at least leaves out the argument. At least it provides the arguments for the existence of God. Also, it gives a very good outline of like the strong arguments for the reasons why God probably doesn't exist. And then I think it does give a really good outline of like what the possible roots of religion are across the world, and then along with the roots of morality, along with this like what potentially are some of the issues of religion, and along with like then it sort of like goes on some sort of like other potential points about religion, such as like the point of God giving need for God to give consolation. I do think it's a very good book. I know it has issues with it. A lot of people think that Dawkins' writing is very aggressive. I didn't personally find that, but I think if you are religious, then I can see that perspective. There is definitely going to be a subjectivity there. I don't quite agree with critics of the book who say like, "Oh, Dawkins doesn't understand religion or theology," and I don't get the case. When I do look at when I have looked searched sort of critique of the book online on like various reviews online, looked at Reddit, looked at Quora, etc. I generally find that particularly on Reddit and Quora, when you actually look at the reasons why they don't like the book, why they say the book is weak, you'll find that there isn't one from the Christians. They'll just say, "Oh, Dawkins doesn't understand theology," but they won't actually back that up and provide an example as to why the argument is weak. That's generally the norm, is what I see. I do think there's something though in the value of religion. And some people like Jordan Peterson or maybe Tom Holland have said about that religion can provide a sort of like can help grow a person, and I think can provide depth. I think Dawkins himself, though, I mean, he's come back later to say that he's a cultural Christian, by the way, and I do think there's, and he himself, I think, would agree, is there's value in being a cultural Jew or a cultural Muslim or cultural Christian. I mean, much of our cultural inheritance does come from these Abrahamic religions. If you're particularly from the Middle East and Europe, there's other places in the world as well like that. Even Dawkins, even in the God Delusion, is saying there's value in being a cultural Christian. What I think he's really getting at, though, is some of the strong arguments why there is a low probability as to why there's a God. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole book with you. Maybe I'll just go through maybe two arguments that I think are quite powerful in the book. One is from the religious perspective is like the first cause argument. I mean, this is probably the principal argument that religious people use for the argument of God, and that is like, well, how could something come from nothing, or what was the first cause of the universe? And I think from a sort of philosophical perspective, there is this idea that it must have been supernatural for it to come out being. Dawkins' way is sort of like extending on a counter argument that's often raised is like, well, how can you explain then the existence of God? But what sort of Dawkins adds on to this argument, I think it's relatively novel. I mean, I'm not an expert in this field, but what he's arguing about is the idea that this being that created the universe, it must have been so complicated to have set up all the laws of the universe, to have finely tuned the universe, to have be communicating with all these trillions and trillions of people across all these multiple planets the whole time, and assessing whether they're good and bad, etc. That this person is not the person is not a simple being, it must be very complicated. And so how can this very complicated being have just, I mean, there must be, and it must have come from something. There must be an explanation as to how it came from something. So it's not really answering the question by this godlike figure to explain how the origin of the universe comes. Doesn't really doesn't really explain much because it's not a simple argument, and so it's really an argument in some ways. The best we can say at the moment is that there's a big unknown as to what the origin of the universe was. Um, I do think that's fair. I mean, some people might say, well, throwing back from the sort of the evolutionary idea of irreducible complexity. So, like, the problem with God is that he's irreducibly complex, based on this idea of him being very, very complicated. There, it's an interesting argument. He calls it Dawkins calls it the ultimate Boeing 747. I think, in addition to that, I think there's what Dawkins is pushing throughout this book is because he's an evolutionary biologist, is very much this idea of natural selection, being able to explain how organisms basically came from being very, very simple to then building up to these very, very complex beings that we are now, and that's i.e. through natural selection, where you have this accumulation of improvements over massive timescales will basically have this effect. There is obviously, of course, different from like how the origin of life and how that came from sort of like, I suppose, rocks and basic chemistry to like the origin of life, and then also how did the cell evolve, etc., etc. I mean, there still is a lot of questions to be answered for, but I think he does make a good case for natural selection and evolution, explaining the complicated design of life, as he does also. I mean, he goes into a lot of other interesting points. I mean, around sort of like talking about sort of like the meta universe and how that might potentially be an explanation for some of the things we see via universe in terms of like it being perfectly aligned for us allowed to live in this. He does talk about these points. I'm not going to spend loads and loads of time on this, but I do think it's interesting. I did find it really interesting about the roots of religion. I think this is a really interesting topic. Like, for example, one of the ideas is like humans could be psychologically primed for religion. I thought this was a really fascinating idea, and also how our brains, we may naturally be dualists, so particularly children. So this is the idea that some people very much experience this idea of us having there being a difference between a soul-like quality and matter. This is comparative like monists who would like believe in that basically mind is just a manifestation of matter, for that matter. I.e., give a basic example: if you took drugs, for example, that would influence your mind, but that's because of the changes in your biochemistry because of the drug you're taking, and that's an extreme example for like how consciousness can be affected by that and other factors such as mental illness. So I do think that's interesting. I mean, and really sort of like religion then, or God, is like seen as like a sort of like a side effect of like the evolution of consciousness that happened in humans. So, and it could be that's something, one of his main things that he talks about. But it's there could be other things like in-group selection. I think that is an idea as well. Along with that, he's talking about like the roots of morality, and he's talking about how really people that we're moral now, but we're all moral, both religious and non-religious, because of the times we're living in. These texts, the religious textbooks, don't really have a sort of like an explanation as to why we are moral. And certainly, it's the case that rich people are not more moral. I did also find that there's just lots of good nuggets, I think, in there. There's lots of good stories about the Old Testament and how it can be a bit odd, and also then looking at the New Testament, which I think is, and even Dawkins admits, is admittedly much better, but there still are some issues in terms of morality with the New Testament. So yeah, I do think it's a fantastic book, and I know it's been out for 10 years, but I think it's very much of the times. I do think that regards to the religious perspective, I do think you should read it. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to this.